Hello and welcome to The Periphery, a new podcast from the Pulaski Institution. Pulaski is a new think tank dedicated to the relationship between globalization and current issues in global politics and heartland areas. That means looking at how trade and industry move through and affect places like the American Midwest and post-industrial France, but it also means trying to better understand the kinds of politics that have emerged in many of these places. Oftentimes, a politics that's populist, opposed to things like international trade and foreign integration, and in many places, skeptical about democracy. We're excited to use this podcast to help add to what we can bring to the public on these topics, and really glad you decided to come back and keep listening. Our guest today is Dr. William Haden Chomphosy. William is an assistant professor of economics at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, and is also a non-resident fellow at the Pulaski Institution. William works in environmental economics, and we're going to be talking a lot today about climate change and how the economics around key issues in energy and land use, as well as new technologies like carbon capture, can be brought to bear on rural communities, particularly in America. So welcome, William.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here and talk about some of the work that I've been doing on these issues.
Cool. So to kick us off, I wanted to get into some research that you and your colleagues recently published about the prevalence of abandoned oil and gas wells across the U.S. Particularly where we're recording this right now, which is Arkansas. I think some people might be aware that Arkansas was part of the natural gas boom in the mid-2000s, and that's dried up, obviously, in a number of places. But it was also a key oil-producing state in the early 20th century. I think it's worth mentioning that southern Arkansas was actually home to the world's largest oil-producing site during the 1920s near Smackover. And so now the state, like a lot of the country, is littered with these oil and gas wells that are abandoned, not being used. And I think in Arkansas, it's something close to 80% of those sites at this point. And this is obviously not just an Arkansas issue, and your research obviously is national, but there's a lot of places where there was initially a big benefit from this gas boom, and now they're dealing with the kind of hangover effect, I think, of that. And so I'm interested in just having you lay out sort of the problem space that this presents to these sort of rural areas in states like Arkansas.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So, as you say, whenever we have had kind of any period of big production in oil or natural gas that is necessarily accompanied by the drilling of wells, but also infrastructure that support these wells. That includes well pads or roads and all of these different kind of habitat intrusions that disrupt the potential for ecosystem services in any of those spaces. And we looked at that across the entire United States using a data set of oil wells and natural gas wells that had been abandoned. So what we collected were over 400,000 wells that we determined to be abandoned, but also able to be restored. So we called those restorable wells. And because there's infrastructure beyond the wells themselves, we also included how the infrastructure around the wells translated into an actual geographic space. So 430,000 wells thereabout translates to over 800,000 hectares of restorable land. And to put that in the context of something like acres, 800,000 hectares turns into, or is equivalent to, about just under 2 million acres of land. So it's a lot of space within the United States, which at the moment is just producing no economic value at all, right? Because the land was changed for the purpose of natural resource extraction. But once those resources dry up, which they always will in an oil or natural gas well, there's not the same kind of motivation or profit motivation to restore that land. And so it's really a large opportunity that's kind of just being left on the table, so to speak.
Yeah, so I'm interested in, it's like a lot of what we're talking about, right, is sort of the opportunity cost of this land going unused, right? And a lot of it's in these really agricultural states. So I'm curious if we could kind of get into the weeds a bit on that, on the sort of the opportunity costs that are being already sort of faced by not taking advantage of what could be done with this land, particularly in places that are high agricultural producers.
So first, I want to talk a little bit about what opportunity cost is and not get a little bit too jargony. So whenever we're talking about an opportunity cost, it is some positive benefit that is an opportunity that we're not currently taking advantage of. So in the case of this land that could be restored, a lot of it is found in high value agricultural land. For example, almost half of the wells that we identified as restorable, so just over 180,000 of the restorable wells, those are found in grasslands and pastures. At the moment, those cannot be fully utilized for the agricultural production because of the oil wells, the natural gas wells, and the associated infrastructure that impacts that space. So what we did is we looked at what would the economic value be if we restored the land that's currently underutilized, so to speak. And we found enormous economic value from agricultural benefits and from the value of carbon dioxide that could be sequestered in the kind of regrowth, the vegetational regrowth. So in total, we estimated that the present value of ecosystem services from restoring the land around those wells would be in the range of $21 billion, while the restoration costs were only estimated to be around $7 billion. So to kind of sum all of that up, there are almost 2 million acres of land in the United States that we're not using to their best effect. And as a consequence, we're giving up $21 billion in economic value. And in order to kind of enjoy those benefits, it would only cost $7 billion. So we believe that the net benefits are well above zero in this circumstance.
Something that what you're saying makes me a little bit curious about is, I've lived in Arkansas most of my life. A lot of my friends had energy companies come in. I'm from sort of north central Arkansas, so the Fayetteville Shale was in our backyard, and energy companies came in, and people were paid either just straight up like rights to drill or frack, and then also sometimes maybe these convenience fees and other things like that. But at this point, when we're talking about these abandoned well sites, where do they sit in terms of who actually owns them now, and in terms of the actual rights? Like, if we're going to start repurposing these, what are the sort of different what kind, I guess, of different relationships exist in terms of who currently has control over the land?
So that is probably going to vary kind of state by state. But what I believe is generally going to be accurate is that the oil wells and the infrastructure itself is still owned by the company, although that may be on the land of private landholders, right? So it kind of sounds too like, where is the burden of responsibility for that restoration coming from? And, it really can be context dependent, and especially in terms of state policies and state laws, that's where a lot of it comes down. So even if the oil well is still technically being held by the resource company, the energy company, the landholder could still potentially want to restore the land. But in either case, what we're seeing is just that there's not enough motivation to do that. And that's not true everywhere. I feel like I should say that Oklahoma has a pretty good system in place for oil well restoration. And we were able to speak to like some folks on that side and what they do. And it ranges from, going in and taking out a well entirely to restoring land that has a lot of erosion or salt scarring from the operations. So depending on where you are, the responsibility for who kind of takes on that restoration varies. And you also see a high variance in how much actual progress is taken there.
Yeah, that's another thing I think I was curious about. I mean, one of the more negative, I think, kind of the media narratives around fracking was often sort of the questions about water quality in areas where fracking was occurring. So I think, to my mind, a follow-on to this is, when we talk about restoring these areas for agricultural use, what kind of questions come up with actually is the groundwater in the soil like suitable and safe to start growing crops again that essentially turn into food for human consumption?
Right. So we did not get into so much of the details with like soil quality and things of that nature. And as you say, a lot of the discussions around fracking have related to water quality. What we looked at more specifically was, okay, if you have a certain amount of land, can we come up with an estimate for its restoration kind of writ large? And so this actually does call attention to what I would say is a pretty critical area for research to understand this process better, which is to really get more detailed and nuanced estimates and studies of the restoration cost itself. That is one thing that in our research we've like really found to be true, is that the information necessary to understand the costs is very limited. And I think that's primarily because it's proprietary for these individual businesses and companies. So your question about like what needs to go into these places to really bring them back to par in order to kind of produce crops, there needs to be more detailed research and information on that.
So if we're sitting here and saying, okay, there is all this land, but there's not enough motivation to repurpose it, right? It's sitting there, and the big problem is profit motive. It seems like that's a common thread across a lot of issues in sustainability and sort of climate economics in general. So, I mean, do you guys see any kind of innovative ways that people are trying to find that do motivate people, that provide that kind of incentive? And do you think that these potentially relate to other tools in the kind of toolkit that might exist to kind of push along more sustainable or more environmentally sort of net positive activity that needs to happen, but maybe sort of there's not a clear stakeholder who has an obvious incentive to act without being pushed a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point that you're bringing up. So whenever we're talking about an absence of motivation, I think that really what it comes from is the fact that the environment is kind of like this shared commodity. Specifically, the quality or the health of the environment, it does not have what we might call strong property rights. There is not, a single stakeholder who owns the environment, who can profit off of its well-being, or a market really that exists to identify all of the benefits that we see from the ecosystem and the ecosystem services that we have, right? So that is a principal challenge to getting really good environmental protection whenever a lot of the most common tools that we use for assigning value come from markets which require these strong property rights. So if the question, that I also heard in there was, are there kind of innovative ways? Are there ways to identify these motivations more clearly? I would say that to a degree, yes, right? So ecosystem services valuations are definitely a growing body within the environmental economics literature. And so whenever I'm talking about ecosystem service valuation, it is assigning a dollar value to the services that the environment provides to humans and to the economy and, to market economies as well, right? So there are more and more papers coming out. There are organizations that are kind of dedicated to the economic evaluation of, these services, whether that is, pollination services, climate regulation, biodiversity, these things which we have traditionally had a hard time assigning value to. We're trying to find better ways. And that can range in terms of the methodology, but that is what we were trying to do with looking at the agricultural value from restoration, but also what is the value of the carbon dioxide that gets stored within the vegetation that comes back whenever we restore these lands.
You mentioned that you feel like Oklahoma has a pretty good restoration policy in how they approach this land use. Can you get a little bit into like what they do and whether you think that works outside their specific case?
Yeah, so what really kind of led us to that realization was that we're trying to find better cost information on what does it take to actually get lands restored and how much does that cost. So in trying to kind of explore what information was out there, we came across basically the Oklahoma state organization that's responsible for kind of energy and oil drilling and that sort of thing. They have a really good resource where if you are a landowner and you have an abandoned well on your property, it is a website that's very straightforward on how to like make a claim. They have funds that are kind of set aside for restoration. And while our conversations with that organization could not really reveal the specific details or, again, not to get too technical, they didn't reveal a cost function, so to speak, it did demonstrate that Oklahoma is taking specific steps to making it easier for restoration to occur. And so those funds, they usually come from fees that have to be paid whenever a well gets drilled, and those get put into a bond that are set aside for end-of-life oil well restoration. But across our research of all these different places, Oklahoma stood out as an organization where the responsible state organization had a good tool that identified exactly what landholders needed to do and how they could make a claim to get restoration and how much money they had actually spent on that restoration. And it was very transparent, very forthcoming, which we didn't see in other places.
So much of I feel like what we're getting at gets towards a little bit of a political problem, right, to bring politics into this, which is that a lot of the conversation in the United States, and some of this I think is fair, and some of this is I think unfair, and definitely a product of obviously parties and rhetoric around the issue that's meant to drive this thinking. But it's the idea that when it comes to green issues, whether that is shifting the fuel sources we rely on, whether that is engaging in a sort of environmentally restorative projects, whether that is transit infrastructure overhauls, that somehow rural America is going to bear the burden of that in a way that doesn't really translate into as much benefit. That somehow rural America, whether that's the questions of like coal country and even some of the places where natural gas is still found, being transitioned away from those economies, which have been, at least for some people, quite profitable, whether that's a question of, land use and sort of the need to retool the way we everything from grow crops to build our transit infrastructure through the middle of the country, that the idea that somehow rural America is going to get left out, really. That somehow green policies and green economics are about servicing cities and making rural America and the parts of America that are the sources of a lot of this energy somehow really pay the cost without seeing the benefits. So I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about what I think you've already hinted at, which is the huge amount of, I think, economic opportunity there is in this, and then maybe how that relates to some other sort of green initiatives in environmental economics that do point to ways that actually rural America can benefit substantially.
Yeah, so I think that what my mind goes to immediately right there is that the rural parts of the country, whether it's at the state level or broader, right, the rural areas of the country, that is where our natural capital is currently being held, right? So whenever I use the phrase natural capital, I am talking about the elements or the environment in which a lot of the productive capacity of the environment is, right? So where do we have trees? Where do we have free-flowing waterways? Where do we have the ecosystem services actually being generated? And those are in those rural areas, because in highly developed, highly urbanized environments, we've used up all of the natural capital or displaced it. So whenever we're talking about tools for really understanding the value or understanding the motivation for environmental protection, I say that we see the greatest values in the places where you don't have a lot of economic development. So within our paper, we actually kind of create a heat map where the value of restoration is largest. And this is taking account of both the agricultural value that we calculate and the carbon sequestration value that we calculate. And it's primarily in the south, central, and middle of the United States where there is a lot of open space. There's a lot of space that has not been paved over to simplify the process of urbanization and development. So in those rural areas, having a better idea, having better information really, and more easily understood information about the value that's being held in the natural capital of those spaces, I think that's what's going to be really, really impactful for something that you might call a green initiative, but really what it's doing is it's just trying to translate value of the environment into a language that's common across a lot of folks, right? And that is dollar values.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's what I think is so valuable about this research in the first place. Not to, valuable. It's talking about values. Not an intentional pun, but I think that's what's so compelling about this topic and the work you're doing, right? Is that a lot of times we probably don't do a very good job of talking about some of these issues in the sort of concrete, like you said, dollar and cents ways. This puts money back into the pockets of a lot of people. And obviously, like you've said, there are places that seem to have recognized that. There are like programs that seem to have comprehended like the advantages of offering these kinds of incentives to people. So I guess that the other thing I want to ask about is you mentioned the potential for carbon sequestration. And I'm a little bit curious about exactly how that might work. And really, I guess I'm also curious geographically, sort of, are there places that are more suitable to that in the United States than others in terms of what are the necessary conditions for that being a potential land use?
Right, yeah. So carbon sequestration is something that the word or the phrase kind of gets bandied around a lot. Like it gets thrown out there and discussed at great detail. And really, it's describing the process by which whenever plants are growing, they are taking in carbon dioxide as a necessary component to their growth, and they actually store it within that biomass. So whenever we're talking about the value of carbon sequestration, what we're really describing is for every unit, so let's say every ton of carbon that gets stored within a tree or within a pasture or whatever it may be, how is that avoiding damages in the future, right? And so specifically, we're looking at these models that basically assign an estimated damage from carbon dioxide emissions in the future, and then turning that around by saying, well, if we can capture that carbon dioxide into a tree or into grassland or whatever it may be, what is the value of the damages that we are avoiding, right? So that's what we're describing whenever we're saying the value of carbon sequestration. And so, yeah, geographically, there are definitely some differences in like where we see that value coming from, because the amount of carbon that gets captured is a function of the mature biomass that's doing the capturing. So if you can imagine a large oak tree after 50 years, it has a lot of biomass. And then if you compare that to, let's say, a desert, where maybe there are some shrubs and there's real value, there's real ecosystem service value in deserts. I can't stress that enough. But it doesn't show up in the carbon sequestration as much as it might be in a large forest, right? So whenever we were looking at the carbon sequestration values, we definitely do see concentrations in places that we would identify as deciduous or coniferous forests, as opposed to arid or semi-arid lands, and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely variation across land uses and biomes in terms of where we're seeing values coming from.
Okay, I think this is the perfect segue to asking you some questions about carbon capture. But before I do that, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and pick up and talk about carbon capture. Hey everyone, Alan here, just cutting in to say that the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution, that's the full name of this podcast, is available on a range of podcasting platforms, including Spotify and now Stitcher. And you can always keep up with the podcast by going to pulaskiinstitution.org and clicking on the Periphery tab. Episodes are uploaded there as well. And you're also welcome to visit our site. I encourage you to go there. Enjoy posts from the Pulaski blog by our fellows and graduate contributors and guest expert writers. And you can also keep up to date on the projects we're getting underway as we launch. So just a quick break to remind you to visit our website and also to subscribe to this podcast wherever you prefer to get your podcasts. And with that, back to the interview with William Haden Chomphosy. Okay, so we were talking about carbon sequestration, which I think is a natural way to pivot to one of the more interesting technologies that's still really in its infancy, but on the one hand has a lot of promise and on the other maybe faces quite a bit of challenges, which is carbon capture technology. So just this month in Iceland, they opened a new carbon capture plant that's supposed to be the world's largest. And I think it offers a great opportunity to chat a little bit about why it's seen as so promising to some people and why others who look at carbon capture and say the challenges of climate change right now are so urgent we don't have time for this. So I'd like you to tell me a little bit about sort of where we're at with the economics of carbon capture and what those sort of challenges and opportunities are that both sides kind of talk about, and whether or not you think this is the kind of thing that could be beneficial for rural areas.
Right. So in thinking about carbon capture, essentially, I think we should kind of establish the baseline for what kind of technology that we're describing. So there are a variety of different kinds of ways to achieve this goal, but by and large, what carbon capture and storage is doing is literally collecting carbon dioxide emissions and then storing them in one way, shape, or form. It's really attractive from an economics perspective, especially if we're thinking about from the perspective of kind of contemporary economic participants. Like I'm thinking specifically of agents within the energy sector, because we have a fuel source that is relatively abundant. We have a lot of experience working with it, and there is a very well established market for the distribution and use of that resource. And those are fossil fuels, right? So fossil fuels are a resource that we use a lot of, that we really understand quite well, and there's a lot of it, right? So I'm thinking specifically in that circumstance about coal, right? Like, yeah, coal is a non-renewable resource, but there is so much of it. It's crazy, right? So if we have this resource, we would like to use it. But the reason why it's bad, right, is that it's producing these greenhouse gases that are contributing to, a greenhouse effect that is having pronounced impacts on our climate. So the dream of carbon capture and storage is to continue using the resource that we know and love, quote unquote, without the bad effect, right? If we could just get rid of the carbon dioxide emissions going into the atmosphere and accumulating and contributing to the greenhouse effect, then we could see the persistence of this market, which has come under some scrutiny, or you might even say outright attack. So that's the dream. That's like the big benefit, right? However, as you say, there are challenges, which are that the technology is very much in its infancy. So the new carbon capture facility in Reykjavik, right? So I think it's like the Orca carbon capture facility or something like that. Yeah. So they are currently operating under the assumption or under the kind of cost structure that every ton of carbon dioxide that's captured costs between $600 to $800. And that is an enormous amount of money whenever you consider how much carbon dioxide we produce in a given year within a given country. So it's really, really, really expensive. And that's in the largest facility that's currently in operation. So you might imagine that if there were any economies of scale, which is to say, if there is a way to lower costs by expanding operation, that's where we would see it. We would see it in the biggest facility that we have ever seen, and it's still $600 to $800 per ton. So it's not cheap. And, technology moves quite rapidly, especially whenever there are major incentives here. And the other part of the carbon capture storage incentive is that it starts to let you create a market for pollution, which becomes very, very attractive because it means that A, we can cut down on pollution, B, there's a system in place, that being a market, that will help us do that in a good way, in a way that is consistent with a lot of other economic structures that we see today. But it's just still so costly. It's kind of hard to imagine how quickly that's going to come online, especially when every single week, every month, every year, we're getting reminders that we're not moving fast enough.
Right. It's probably important to remind people that when we talk about carbon emissions in general, when countries talk about their targets and we talk about standards for emissions, the word net is super important to that conversation, right? When you talk about the desire to sort of keep using fossil fuels but just extract them out, then as long as I can come to essentially a net zero or even potentially a net negative someday, that's the aspiration, I think.
Right.
Then there's a sense that it doesn't really matter if you're putting out emissions as long as you're offsetting them. And obviously, carbon capture offers the most direct kind of offset, which is just to literally pull it out of the air. So I think that I can understand why it's such a sort of dreamy, aspirational technology for people. But it sounds like you're saying essentially we're probably pretty far away from being able to do anything with it.
Well, so here's what I think about this. It is foolish to search for a single silver bullet to fix the problem, right? It is not a matter of, innovating our way out of having to care about emissions. And it may also be kind of short-sighted or unrealistic to say that the solution is to just pull back to conserve so much that we're really taking a lot of opportunities away from people in order to cut back on these emissions too. It's not an all or nothing proposition, or at least I think that is a foolhardy way to approach the issue. We need to be developing carbon capture and storage, these kind of negative emissions types of technologies, but we should not kind of go along with our lives counting on those technologies to let us continue producing as much emissions as we are or even more. We need to be pairing that with better behaviors and better planning so that we can pull back, so that we can have some degree of kind of conservation, changing our behaviors to where we're producing less emissions, but we're also developing technology that allows us to manage our emissions better. So it has to be a multifaceted plan. And I think that even though the carbon capture technology dream is a very attractive one, we're not going to get there fast enough let me rephrase that. We will not develop the carbon capture technology fast enough to where we don't also have to cut back our emissions in other ways.
I think that's extremely well put, and a good summary of a lot of the challenges. Speaking of other tools, though, we put out a video. Pulaski Institution has a YouTube page. We put out a video that we produced with you on revenue neutral carbon pricing and how we can use carbon pricing, and specifically how that can help rural communities, kind of bring it back to this connection between how we're going to sort of deal with sort of environmental and green-oriented economic initiatives in rural areas. So I was wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about that tool as a way to fight climate change and also as a way to potentially put revenue into rural America.
Yeah, I think that revenue-neutral carbon pricing strategies are actually a much more effective way to try and address greenhouse gas emissions while also focusing on rural communities. The carbon capture technology stuff, right? That's going to generate revenue. It's going to put a price on pollution, which we need to have in order to reduce it. But there's no guarantee that that money is going to go to these rural types of areas. If instead of, or if alongside even the carbon capture technology, we had a revenue neutral carbon price that was reimbursed to American citizens, and even maybe focusing those reimbursements in the rural areas where we need the most climate resiliency, really, I think it would be a much more effective and a much more attractive proposition whenever we're thinking about the well-being of rural communities, and protecting the environment.
You mentioned the need for resiliency in these areas. I think not that a lot of people don't recognize the dangers that climate change presents to sort of the heartland America, but I do think oftentimes so much of the focus is on rising sea levels and the huge cost presented by often coastal storms like hurricanes and the associated flooding that comes with it. I was interested if you could talk a little about the sort of specific costs we're sort of staring down the barrel of in the middle of the country in terms of the economic consequences of climate change and what we're facing in places like Arkansas.
Right. So whenever we're talking about these consequences of climate change, there are these kind of big marquee events that catch headlines. But it's always important to keep in mind that those are just the extreme events that kind of punctuate this more gradual changing climate and changing environment. So even though, sea level rise is something that we should pay attention to, that's happening gradually. But there's also other effects, particularly in the middle of the country, things like longer periods of drought, but also more intense raining seasons. And even though it kind of sounds curious that we could have both of those problems at the same time, that's exactly what's kind of happening. And whenever you have both of those things happening, at least in tandem, then it makes the problems of each one worse. So in Arkansas, for instance, we're having a really long dry season this year, and it's impacting our rice farmers in a big way, right? They want the rains to come back. But if you think back maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when there were heavy rains in the summer throughout the Midwestern U.S., it led to huge floods. And Arkansas's farms, anywhere really along the river there, were really, really disastrously affected, right? And that's true up in Oklahoma and Missouri and these other places in the middle of the country. So droughts can catch headlines. Droughts are definitely things that can be big marquee types of news, but they are much more present with in the minds of the people who are constantly needing the rain or are constantly paying for irrigation, right? So those are the farmers that are like in the middle of the country here. And then on the alternative side, whenever we're seeing those big flooding events like we saw a few summers ago, again, that's hitting the middle of the country, and in particular, farm production, really, really hard. And this is also a moment for us to acknowledge that whenever we talk about the farmers, it's also important to acknowledge that those farmers are a major engine of economic activity in the broader rural economy. So if your farmers aren't doing well, then that impacts all of the service industries that are kind of around the farming sector, as well as consumption and other thing in those rural economies.
So I thought kind of maybe as a parting question here, what would you say if I create this sort of artificial, and yes, it's a little bit of a construct, maybe person from Missouri or Kansas who is a farmer, and then maybe also a person from West Virginia who is family has worked in coal mines, and these people say, look, I understand everything you're saying. I understand that there are potential benefits to some of these policies and changes. I even understand the way that we are facing some kind of trade-off, right? But at the end of the day, you're asking us to give up our entire economic system in a way that you're not asking other parts of the country to do, right? Whether that's the reliant on sort of like, not just the extraction of fossil fuels from the country, from the ground, right? Like in West Virginia with coal, or what was going on with these oil and gas wells, but also just the kind of maybe more emission intensive stuff, carbon intensive activities in terms of the way we do industrial farming, in terms of the changes that are probably going to have to happen, right? If we price carbon, it's not just going to affect cities and factories, right? It's going to affect even farmers, right? Because there's all sorts of heavy industry and heavy industrial equipment that's involved in large scale farming. So what do you say to those people who stand there and say, all of that makes sense, but you're asking us to pay a huge upfront cost? Is that a mistaken impression, or is that true? But there are things that we could say that maybe aren't being stressed enough.
Right. I think that impression is entirely accurate, right? So I don't think that it is fair to these people who are affected by whether it's a carbon tax or, putting a price on carbon in any way. I don't think that it's fair to deny the fact that, yes, there are costs, and those costs are going to impact their lives, right? What I would respond with is the benefits are there too, right? So while you might experience those upfront costs in a very impactful and very meaningful way, the benefits are present as well, and they're just going to get larger, right? So it's challenging at times to pay a cost now with the expectation of a benefit that's forthcoming. However, if we don't pay these costs, then they're only going to get larger and the benefits are going to get smaller. If we keep kicking the can down the road, to use a metaphor, then it's going to become more expensive to address the climate change problem, and the benefits get pushed even further away. So while it's a challenging thing to do, and while it is by no means all benefit and it will be nothing but sunshine and roses, right? I'm not saying that, but we're just going to make the problem worse and worse if we continue to do nothing about it. So with that in mind, I would still advocate for well-designed policies and well-designed plans that account for the fact that there are different impacts in different places to policies that try to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. I am thinking specifically of putting a price on carbon dioxide, whether it's purchasing offsets or having a carbon tax, whatever it is. That's the policy I'm thinking about, and building in these plans that better equip people to pay those costs, specifically if they are going to be paying the larger portion of the costs, such as farmers and people in rural communities. So a revenue neutral carbon price where the reimbursement is weighted toward the people who will suffer more of the costs. And I think that is a way to just kind of really emphasize that it can be a win-win. Not to say that there will not be costs and that it will be easy, but that we can design good policy to where we're prepared for those costs.
Okay. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have you today. Before we go, I want to ask you what I have been asking everyone, which is, given that Pulaski is focused on these kinds of somewhat left behind, but also just places that are away from the center, whether that's the center of just economic activity or also political power. What I've been asking everyone is a place, either where they live now or where they're from, or maybe where they spent a long time, that they think is sort of criminally underrated. That if someone were to go to that part of whether it's the U.S. or somewhere else, that they should check out.
Yeah, so I grew up in Northwest Arkansas, and so that is an area of the country that's very near and dear to my heart. So I think that a real gem of the Northwest Arkansas environment is the Buffalo National River. So that's the first river in the U.S. that was ever designated as a national river. It's one of the few that is still truly free flowing, which is to say that it does not have a system of a whole lot of dams that are built along the river. And it's a really special place. So for folks in the southern U.S. or any avid paddlers out there, you may have heard of the river before. So I want to throw in an additional kind of detail to that area, which is if you're in the Boxley Valley, specifically if you are canoeing or kayaking down the river, you should look into Haden Hollow. So that's the tallest free-falling waterfall between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. So you can float a section of the Buffalo National River where there's a pretty obvious pullout where a lot of people will, stow their boats, and then you have this about 1 mile hike through some nice, really dense wooded area. There's beautiful stone out there, and then if you come in on a day where there's been lots of water, you have this 200-foot waterfall that is just truly beautiful. Like, the hike is cool too because it's so densely packed with trees that you don't really see this big grand waterfall until you take the turn right before you see it, and it's just kind of carved out of this big bluff, and it's really, really cool. So the Buffalo National River, and if you're already familiar with the Buffalo, then check out Haden Hollow if you get a chance to visit.
I will totally agree with you there as a fellow Arkansan. And my wife is originally from Texas, and we have not gone to the Buffalo since we've gotten married, and she talks about it every spring and summer. So I think it's going to have to be a to-do list pretty soon. Well, it was an absolute joy to have you here, man, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I was happy to be here.
The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.